The photograph fell from the Italian leather wallet like an involuntary confession. Penelope Drake froze in the hallway of the Hart mansion, the wallet still in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the image she never should have seen. Camden Hart, the man who occupied her thoughts during endless sleepless nights, was kissing a woman of breathtaking beauty. Not just any kiss, a kiss that contained entire universes of passion, promise, and belonging. The woman wore an ivory silk dress that caught the golden light of the sunset, and her fingers intertwined in his hair communicated an intimacy that pierced Penelope's heart like shattered glass. She should have simply returned the wallet to where she found it, fallen between the velvet couch cushions in the library. But something darker and more primitive awakened in her chest. For 2 years, Penelope had polished the marble floors of that mansion in Newport Beach, prepared meals that were rarely appreciated, and watched Camden Hart exist in his world of corporate meetings and melancholic silences. He had never mentioned a wife. He had never worn a wedding ring. The house breathed loneliness in every empty room, in every window facing the Pacific Ocean, where no one ever watched the sunset. Penelope had convinced herself that Camden was like her, someone navigating existence in self-imposed isolation. This silent fantasy had sustained her days, transformed household chores into acts of secret devotion. She had memorized how he liked his coffee. Strong, unsweetened, with just a touch of cream. She had learned that he preferred the living room curtains open on Tuesday mornings, when the light entered at a certain angle. She had noticed how his shoulders relaxed when she left white lilies in the entryway vase, though he never commented on them. But that photograph demolished every carefully constructed illusion. The pain Penelope felt was neither rational nor justifiable. Camden Hart was her employer. Nothing more. She had no right to the fury boiling in her veins, to the feeling of betrayal that tightened her throat. Yet, emotions rarely consult logic before manifesting themselves. For 3 days, Penelope carried that photo in her uniform pocket, pulling it out in moments of weakness, studying every detail as if she could decipher a hidden code. Who was that woman? Why was Camden hiding her existence? On the 4th night, something inside her broke. Penelope drove to a 24-hour photocopy store in Costa Mesa, an establishment lit by merciless fluorescent lights where college students printed last-minute assignments and small business owners reproduced flyers. The attendant on duty, a young man with headphones hanging around his neck, barely glanced at her as he programmed the machine for 500 copies. The equipment hummed monotonously, spitting out image after image of that kiss that haunted Penelope. She paid in cash, filled 3 paper bags with the photographs, and returned to the mansion in the early hours of the morning. Camden had traveled to San Francisco on business. She knew his schedule better than her own. She would have enough time. Penelope started in the library, taping photographs onto bookshelves between volumes of classical literature and philosophical treatises that Camden never read. She proceeded to the office, where she affixed images to window frames, to the back of cabinet doors, inside drawers. She hid copies among towels in the master bathroom, among dishes in the gourmet kitchen, inside the pockets of suits hanging in the walk-in closet that occupied an entire room. She slipped photographs between diary pages, inside document holders, taped them to the ceiling above the king-size bed, where Camden slept alone. But she didn't stop at the mansion. Penelope knew the address of Hart Industries' corporate office in the financial district of Los Angeles. She arrived at the glass and steel building before dawn, when only night security guards patrolled the silent corridors. Her maid's uniform served as an invisible credential. Cleaning staff are rarely questioned. She distributed photographs in the lobby, in the elevators, in the 12th floor conference room. She taped images in Camden's private parking space, left stacks of them at the reception desk with a note, "Distribute freely." The following days unfolded in glorious and terrible chaos. Camden's first call came on a Tuesday, his tense voice cutting across the phone line. "Penelope, something extraordinarily disturbing is happening. Someone is distributing photographs of me everywhere. Have you noticed anything suspicious in the house?" She lied with surprising ease, her voice calm and concerned. "No, Mr. Hart. Should I check the security systems?" "Please. And Penelope. If you find out who's doing this, let me know immediately." The irony almost made her laugh. He was searching for the perpetrator, unaware that she answered his phone, prepared his meals, knew every inch of his private life. The photographs reached increasingly wider circles. Co-workers started commenting. Business partners raised eyebrows. On social media, scanned images began circulating with endless speculation. Who is the mysterious woman in the life of lonely billionaire Camden Hart? CEO hides secret romance for years? Headlines multiplied like wildfire. Penelope watched the events unfold with a toxic mix of satisfaction and growing horror. Part of her delighted in the revenge, in the feeling of power over someone who had always seemed unattainable. But another part, deeper and more honest, recognized the monstrosity of her actions. She had unforgivably violated Camden's privacy, transformed an intimate moment into a public spectacle, caused damage that could not be undone. The true magnitude of her actions only revealed itself when Camden returned to Newport Beach. It was a Friday night when Penelope heard the key turning in the front door lock. Her heart raced. She was in the kitchen, pretending to organize cabinets, mentally preparing herself for the inevitable confrontation. Camden would find out. Of course he would. Perhaps the photocopy store's security cameras, or some forgotten detail that connected her to the crime. But when Camden entered the kitchen, his expression was not one of anger. It was something much more complex and unsettling, a deep exhaustion mixed with something that seemed dangerously close to relief? Penelope? His voice sounded different, stripped of the layers of professional formality that always mediated their interactions. "We need to talk." She nodded, unable to form words, her hands gripping the edge of the granite countertop. Camden pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, as if his bones could no longer bear the weight of some invisible burden. For a long moment, he simply looked at his own hands, turning them over as if he had never seen them before. "The woman in that photograph," he began, his voice so low that Penelope had to lean in to hear, "is not who everyone thinks she is." Penelope's heart stopped. Her name was Margot. She was my sister, my twin sister. He raised his eyes, and Penelope saw in them an abyss of pain that made her take a step back. "She died 10 years ago, on what was supposed to be my wedding day." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Penelope felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "The woman who lives in this house, the woman the world knows as my wife, is not Margot. She is an imposter who assumed her identity that day, and I—" His voice cracked. "I have been living this lie because I couldn't find a way out." The silence that followed Camden Hart's words had a physical texture, dense as ocean fog, suffocating as humidity on a stormy day. Penelope gripped the granite countertop so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her entire body trembling with the magnitude of what she had just heard. A twin sister. Dead. An imposter living under the roof of that mansion for an entire decade. "I don't understand." The words left Penelope in a husky whisper, her mind struggling to process information that defied all logic. How is it possible that no one noticed? Her family? Friends? You yourself? Camden ran a hand over his face, a gesture of exhaustion so profound it seemed rooted in his bones. For the first time since Penelope had started working for him, the man seemed completely stripped of the layers of corporate control that always enveloped him like invisible armor. Because the woman impersonating Margot is Vivian Ashford, my sister's best friend since childhood. They were inseparable, so close that they were often mistaken for each other. Vivian knew every detail of Margot's life, every mannerism, every story, every secret. He rose from the chair, moving to the window that overlooked the garden steeped in darkness. On the wedding day, there was an accident. Margot was driving to the ceremony when a truck lost control on the Pacific Coast Highway. Her car was thrown off the cliff. Penelope covered her mouth with her hand, tears stinging her eyes. The pain in Camden's voice was palpable, each word laden with years of unresolved grief. Vivian was in the car with her. She survived with serious injuries, but Margot... His voice broke. Margot died instantly. When I arrived at the hospital, Vivian was in an induced coma. The doctors said she would need extensive reconstructive surgeries. I was shattered, in shock, unable to process that my twin sister, my other half, had disappeared in a matter of seconds. He turned to face Penelope, and she saw in his eyes something she had never expected to witness. Absolute vulnerability, raw and exposed. 3 weeks later, when Vivienne woke up, she said she was Margot. At first, I thought it was post-traumatic confusion, the effect of medication, neurological damage from the accident. But she consistently maintained the story. She knew details only Margot would know, memories of our childhood, private moments we had never shared with anyone. The doctors suggested that Vivian might have developed traumatic dissociation, assuming Margot's identity as a psychological survival mechanism after witnessing her best friend's death. Penelope sank into a chair, her legs unable to support her any longer. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Layers upon layers of tragedy and deceit, impossibly intertwined. "But you knew," she whispered. "You always knew it wasn't really Margot." "Yes." The word fell like a stone in still water. Twins have a connection that defies rational explanation. I knew, on the most fundamental and instinctive level, that my sister was dead. I felt her absence like a phantom limb, a constant ache where there had once been presence. But Vivian, she was so convincing, so completely transformed into Margot's persona, that my parents, devastated by the loss, accepted the illusion with desperate gratitude. They preferred to believe their daughter had survived, even if something in her had changed, rather than face the unbearable truth of her permanent disappearance. Camden returned to the table, his hands trembling slightly as he traced invisible patterns on the wooden surface. "And I was too cowardly to destroy their comfort. My father was ill, his heart weak. Doctors warned that another shock could kill him. My mother was already consuming antidepressants as if they were candy. So, I made a choice." He raised his eyes, and Penelope saw in them a guilt so profound it cut like a blade. "I chose the lie. I chose to let Vivian live as Margot, to let my parents believe their daughter had returned, even if transformed by trauma." "But why would Vivian do that?" The question escaped Penelope before she could contain it. Why assume someone else's identity, live a lie for an entire decade? Camden's expression hardened, something darker crossing his features. Because Vivian always loved what Margot had. Our family, our wealth, the social status. She came from modest circumstances, a scholarship student at the private academy where she met my sister. Margot was generous, always sharing everything, but for Vivian, it was never enough. She wanted to completely belong, to be a heart by birth rather than by association. The accident offered her that opportunity on a silver platter. He stood up again, moving through the kitchen with contained nervous energy. In the early years, I kept my emotional distance. Vivian played the part perfectly in public, but in private, we maintained a cordial and cold coexistence. She had her room, I had mine. She participated in necessary family events, managed charitable foundations on behalf of the Hearts, played the role of dedicated heiress, and I built this corporate empire, immersed myself in work, until exhaustion silenced my thoughts. Penelope felt tears streaming down her cheeks, the weight of Camden's tragedy crushing her chest, and along with the compassion came a devastating wave of shame. She had exposed this man to merciless public scrutiny out of childish jealousy, spread his private pain as sensational gossip, turned his silent suffering into entertainment for the masses. Camden. Her voice came out strangled. I did something terrible. He stopped, turning slowly to face Penelope. Something in Penelope's expression must have communicated her guilt, because recognition crossed his eyes. It was you. It wasn't a question, but a calm realization. You distributed the photographs. Penelope couldn't maintain eye contact, her head bowing in scorching shame. I found the photo in your wallet. I saw you kissing that woman and I thought you were hiding a marriage, a secret wife. I got angry, blindly and stupidly angry, and I wanted. Her voice broke. I wanted to hurt you like I felt hurt. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Penelope expected fury, expected to be fired immediately, possibly even sued. But when Camden finally spoke, his voice carried something completely unexpected. You freed me. Penelope snapped her head up abruptly, confusion etched on her tear-streaked face. Camden approached, stopping a few feet from her. That photograph was taken on Margot's last day alive, hours before the accident. It was the last moment of pure happiness we shared, before everything fell apart. I have carried it with me for 10 years as both a talisman and a torture. And when you spread it throughout the world, when you forced that image into the public light, something changed. He pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of Penelope, his hands resting on his knees. Vivian called me this afternoon, hysterical. The photographs terrified her because they reveal a truth she cannot explain. Everyone who knew Margot is looking at that image and noticing subtle discrepancies. The way she held my face, the specific intimacy of twins that cannot be replicated. People are asking questions Vivian cannot answer without exposing the charade. A spark of something that could be hope shone in his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, I have a way out. Your impulsive and vengeful action accidentally created the conditions for me to finally tell the truth, for me to free my family from this lie that has consumed us. Penelope shook her head, unable to process the surreal twist of the situation. But I violated your privacy, caused public humiliation, acted in a completely inexcusable way. Yes, Camden simply agreed. You did all of that. And yet, the outcome might be my salvation. He reached out, hesitant, before gently touching Penelope's shoulder. I'm not saying your methods were right or justifiable, but sometimes the most imperfect actions lead to unexpectedly redemptive consequences. They remained like that, in a charged silence, as the night deepened beyond the windows and the Pacific Ocean murmured its eternal song on the cliffs below. Penelope felt as if she were in some alternate universe where cause and effect operated under completely different rules. "What happens now?" she finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. Camden leaned back in the chair, exhaustion returning to his features. "Now, I call my lawyers. I gather documentary evidence about the accident, medical testimonies, everything that can substantiate the truth. And then—" He took a deep breath, like someone preparing to dive into icy waters. "Then I tell my parents that their daughter truly died 10 years ago, that they have lived an entire decade in an illusion built on tragedy and deceit." The next morning arrived with a cruel clarity that seemed to expose every fracture in the Hart Mansion's carefully constructed facade. Penelope hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night sitting in the small chair in her back-of-the-property room, watching the Pacific waves break against the rocks, while her mind endlessly processed her conversation with Camden. The revelation about Margot and Vivienne, the decade of lies woven in silence, and her own accidental complicity in dismantling it all, each thought was a shard of glass cutting into her consciousness. When she finally made her way down to the kitchen at 6 in the morning, she found Camden already seated at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of documents, an open laptop displaying multiple spreadsheets, and 3 empty coffee cups that bore witness to his own sleepless night. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before, his shirt collar unbuttoned, his normally impeccable hair disheveled by nervous fingers that had clearly run through it repeatedly. "Penelope!" His voice was rough, worn. "You need to know what's happening before Vivienne returns. She's in Santa Barbara visiting her mother, but she'll be back this afternoon." Penelope nodded, automatically moving to brew fresh coffee, her hands performing the familiar routine while her mind struggled to stay present. Camden watched her with a newfound intensity, as if seeing her for the first time. Not just the invisible housekeeper who kept his home running, but a real person whose actions had irrevocably altered the course of his existence. "My lawyer will be here in an hour," Camden continued, gesturing to the scattered documents. "We spent the night compiling evidence. Records from the original accident, Vivienne's medical reports from the post-trauma period, testimonies from paramedics who were at the scene. We also tracked down the medical examiner who examined Margot. He kept DNA samples, standard procedure, in significant fatal accidents." Penelope placed a steaming cup of coffee before him, her hands trembling slightly. "DNA? Are you going to request a paternity test or something?" "Genetic lineage testing," Camden corrected. "Identical twins share virtually indistinguishable DNA, but there are specific epigenetic markers, patterns of gene expression, that can confirm or deny individual identity when compared with historical samples. Science has advanced significantly in the last decade. What was impossible to verify when the accident happened is now relatively simple." He took a long sip of the coffee, closing his eyes momentarily in appreciation. Even in the existential turbulence that enveloped them, some rituals remained comforting. But before we get to scientific tests, there's a more immediate confrontation that needs to happen. Vivienne needs to have the opportunity to confess voluntarily. She needs to understand that the charade is over, that continuing would be not only ethically indefensible, but legally dangerous. Penelope sank into a chair opposite him, her own cup warming her cold palms. "Do you think she'll admit it? After 10 years of maintaining this lie so perfectly?" "I don't know." The raw honesty in Camden's voice was almost painful. "Part of me still wonders if she genuinely believes she is Margot, If the psychological dissociation mentioned by the original doctors somehow solidified into permanent delusion. But another part, the part that has observed moments of cold calculation in her eyes when she thinks no one is looking, knows that she is perfectly aware of the deception. The front door opened with a distinct click, followed by the familiar sound of high heels against marble. Both froze. Penelope checked the clock. 7:15 in the morning. Vivian wasn't supposed to return before noon. Camden? The voice that echoed through the hall was melodious, cultivated, carrying that specific confidence of someone who grew up, or learned to perfectly mimic, amidst aristocratic privilege. Darling, I'm home early. Mother was impossible, so I decided. Vivian Ashford, living as Margot Hart for a decade, appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped abruptly. Her eyes, greenish-gray where Margot's had been bluish-gray, a subtle difference few would notice, darted from Camden to Penelope, then to the documents spread across the table. Something shifted in her posture, a subtle tension invading her perfectly aligned shoulders. What an interesting morning meeting! Her voice maintained a studied lightness, but Penelope detected the undercurrent of anxiety. Should I be concerned that my husband is having such intimate strategic meetings with the housekeeper? Camden rose slowly, and there was something different about him. A resolve Penelope had never witnessed before, as if some inner support that had been broken for years had finally been repaired. Vivian, we need to talk, and this time, we're going to talk using real names. The blood drained from Vivian's face. For a moment, her carefully maintained mask faltered, and Penelope saw genuine terror cross her features. But only for a moment. Then composure returned, reinforced by years of practice. I don't know what you're talking about. Each word was articulated with glacial precision. Camden, you're frightening me. Are you having some kind of nervous breakdown? Enough. The word left Camden like a judicial sentence. It's over, Vivian. The photographs someone spread around town. You saw them. Everyone saw them. And people who knew Margot, who shared intimate moments with her, are asking questions. Sophia Henderson called me yesterday. Remember her? Margot's best friend from college? She studied that photograph for hours and told me something was wrong. The way Margot held my face, the specific angle, the small details that only someone truly intimate would recognize as authentic or false. Vivian took a step back, her hand reaching for support on the doorframe. Sophia was always dramatic, creating problems where none exist. And then Daniel Morrison called, Margot's cousin, with whom she grew up sharing secrets. He noticed the difference in eye color. He said he thought they were contact lenses, but he started to wonder why Margot would wear contacts to change something so fundamental about her appearance. Camden took a step forward, his voice gaining strength. And then my own father commented last night, for the first time in 10 years, that his daughter looked different in ways he couldn't articulate, but that constantly bothered him. Tears began to stream down Vivian's face, but there was something performative about them, something too rehearsed. Camden, please. You know what I've been through, the trauma of the accident, the reconstructive surgeries. Of course, I'm different, but I'm still me. I'm still... You are not Margot. Camden spoke the words with devastating gentleness. You were never Margot. You are Vivian Ashford, who loved my sister but envied her even more, who saw an opportunity in the darkest moment and seized it with both hands. The silence that followed pulsed with electric tension. Penelope remained frozen in her chair, an unwitting witness to a confrontation she had, in a bizarre and accidental way, orchestrated. Vivian collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, her sobs now genuine and wrenching. When she finally spoke, her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of all cultivated layers of aristocratic refinement, reduced to something raw and broken. "I didn't want her to die." The words came out haltingly, choked by tears. "God, Camden, you have to believe that. I loved her. Margot was the only person in the world who saw me as an equal, who didn't treat me like the poor friend who should be grateful for crumbs of attention. But when the accident happened, when I woke up in that hospital and heard that she had died, but that my face was so damaged it would need to be completely reconstructed." She raised her head, and Penelope saw in her eyes something simultaneously pathetic and terrifying. The absolute vulnerability of someone whose defining lie was finally unraveling. "The doctors showed me images of what needed to be done, told me I could choose what I wanted to look like after the surgeries. And I thought, if I'm going to completely reconstruct my face anyway, why not become the person I always wanted to be? Why not become Margot?" Camden sank back into his chair, as if his legs could no longer support him. So, it was deliberate from the start. It wasn't traumatic dissociation or post-accident confusion. At first, perhaps there was some confusion, Vivian admitted, her voice small. "In the first few days after waking, my mind was fragmented, but when clarity returned and I realized what I had started, the choice presented itself: confess and return to my mediocre life of loneliness and inadequacy, or continue being Margot, being loved and desired, and finally belonging to something greater." She met Camden's eyes with wrenching desperation. "And your parents needed so desperately to believe she had survived. Your mother held my hand and wept with relief, and your father looked at me with such gratitude for being alive. How could I destroy that? How could I take away from them the daughter they had just gotten back?" "So you made the most selfish choice imaginable and justified it as altruism," Camden replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "And you left me to exist in limbo for 10 years, knowing my sister was dead, but unable to properly grieve, because everyone around me was celebrating her miraculous return." Vivian had no answer for that. She remained on the floor, small and broken, the decade of deception finally crumbling around her like a house of cards in a gale. Penelope watched it all with interwoven horror and fascination, finally understanding the full magnitude of what her actions had unleashed. She had hoped to cause Camden pain out of petty jealousy. Instead, she had accidentally provided the key to a prison in which he had been locked for endless years. The doorbell rang, cutting through the dense silence. Camden rose mechanically. "My lawyer is here. Vivian, you have a choice now. You can confess voluntarily, and we will work on a solution that minimizes legal damages and public scandal. Or we can proceed with forensic tests, official investigations, and expose everything in the most brutal way possible." Vivian raised her head, her face stained with tears and smeared mascara, all pretense finally abandoned. "What about your parents? This will kill them. It will hurt them terribly," Camden agreed. "But they deserve the truth. Margot deserves to finally be properly mourned. And I—" his voice faltered momentarily. "I deserve to finally be set free." He left the kitchen to answer the door, leaving Penelope alone with the woman who had lived as a ghost for a decade. Vivian stared at her with something that could be recognition, or perhaps even bitter gratitude. "You spread those photographs, didn't you?" It wasn't an accusation, just an exhausted realization. Penelope nodded slowly, guilt tightening her throat. A humorless laugh escaped Vivienne. "So, should I thank you for finally ending this, or curse you for destroying the only life that ever mattered?" Before Penelope could respond, Camden returned, accompanied by a gray-haired man carrying a leather briefcase, and the morning plunged into legal proceedings that would irreversibly transform all their lives. The 3 days following Vivienne's confession unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence of legal procedures and devastating emotional confrontations. Camden's lawyer, Richard Castellano, a 62-year-old man whose reputation in complex family litigation was legendary in Californian legal circles, transformed the Hart Mansion's library into a temporary operations center, with documents spread across every available surface, and his assistant setting up multiple phone lines for urgent consultations. Penelope found herself in the peculiar position of an unwitting witness to it all, still technically employed, but now functioning more as Camden's silent confidant. He had insisted she stay, not only because he needed someone to keep the house running while the chaos unfolded, but because, in his words, she was the only person in the entire universe who fully understood all the layers of the impossible situation. Vivienne remained in the mansion for the first 2 days, confined to the room she had occupied for a decade, emerging only when summoned for meetings with the lawyers. She had signed a formal confession on the first afternoon, admitting in writing that she had consciously assumed Margot Hart's identity after the accident. The document was being kept under wraps for now, part of a preliminary agreement Richard had negotiated. If Vivienne fully cooperated, including submitting to DNA testing and providing detailed testimony about how she maintained the deception, Camden would not press criminal charges of identity fraud. The cruelest and most necessary part of the process was telling Camden's parents. Penelope was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she heard the sound of tires on gravel, Alexander Hart's black Mercedes pulling onto the property. She watched from the window as Camden greeted his parents at the entrance, the tension visible in his shoulders, even from a distance. Eleanor Hart, a 73-year-old matriarch whose understated elegance had always impressed Penelope on the rare occasions she visited, hugged her son with evident concern. Alexander, a few years older and still recovering from recent heart surgery, moved slower, but his sharp eyes assessed Camden's expression with growing apprehension. Penelope wasn't present in the living room when Camden told them the truth. That would have been an intrusion beyond any justification. But the sound that penetrated the mansion's thick walls 15 minutes later froze her blood. Eleanor Hart's scream carried pain so profound and primal that Penelope felt involuntary tears streaming down her own face. It was the sound of a mother losing her daughter for a second time. The original grief that had never been properly processed, violently colliding with the realization that she had lived in a comforting illusion for 10 entire years. Richard Castellano exited the room quickly, speaking urgently into his cell phone. Minutes later, 2 paramedics arrived. Camden had anticipated his parents might need immediate medical assistance. Indeed, Alexander Hart required supplemental oxygen when his breathing became ragged, while Eleanor was lightly sedated to prevent acute shock. Vivienne emerged from her room at that moment, descending the stairs with hesitant steps, and when Eleanor saw her, something utterly broke. The woman who had believed to be her resurrected daughter for a decade rushed towards Vivienne with a fury Penelope had never imagined possible in someone so refined. Camden intercepted her, holding his mother as she struggled, sobbing incoherent accusations mixed with fragments of Margot's memories that Vivienne could never truly replicate. She used to sing Moon River when she was nervous. Eleanor shrieked through tears, her voice torn. Margot had done that since she was a child, an unconscious tic. You never did it, not once in 10 years. How did I not realize? How could I have been so blind? Vivienne remained frozen on the bottom step of the staircase, her face a mask of guilt and despair. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Don't call me by my name. Eleanor's shriek cut through the air. You have no right, not after stealing my daughter, after stealing even my right to properly mourn her. Alexander, even struggling for breath, found enough voice to add weight to his wife's fury. You made us talk to her at the grave, place flowers, celebrate birthdays, all while my real Margot was dead and gone. What kind of person does that? Richard Castellano intervened gently but firmly, guiding Alexander and Eleanor back to the living room, signaling for the paramedics to continue monitoring them. Camden cast one last look at Vivienne. Not of anger, Penelope noticed, but of something closer to exhausted pity, before following his parents. Penelope found herself alone in the hallway with Vivienne, who sank onto the steps, her body curling in on itself as if trying to disappear. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vivienne raised her head, her red eyes meeting Penelope's. Did you know this would happen when you spread those photographs? The question carried no accusation, just tired curiosity. No, Penelope admitted softly. I didn't know anything. I just wanted to hurt Camden because I thought he was hiding someone he loved. It's pathetic and cruel, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. A humorless smile touched Vivienne's lips. So we both destroyed everything for selfish reasons. I guess that makes us compatible in our shared pathology. What are you going to do now? Penelope heard herself ask, surprised by her own compassion for someone who had caused so much suffering. Vivienne was silent for a long time, looking at her own hands, hands that had been surgically altered during facial reconstruction to perfectly match Margot's, down to the shape of the fingernails and a small scar on her left thumb from a childhood burn that doctors skillfully replicated. Richard negotiated a deal where I can avoid prison if I fully cooperate and agree to disappear from the Harts' lives permanently. There's a financial clause, a small monthly payment, enough to start over somewhere far away, in exchange for my public silence about the more intimate details of the situation. She met Penelope's eyes again. So I'm going somewhere no one knows me as Margot or Vivienne. I'm going to find a therapist who can help me understand why I made such devastatingly destructive choices. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to find some form of redemption. Though I don't believe it's possible. Raised voices came from the living room. Eleanor crying again, Camden trying to comfort her, his own voice broken with emotion. Vivienne flinched at the sound, each sob a reminder of what she had caused. There were times when I truly believed I was her, Vivienne whispered, more to herself than to Penelope. When Eleanor would hug me and call me her daughter, when Alexander and I would watch baseball games the way he used to with Margot, when Camden would smile at me during those rare moments of truce in our shared existence. In those moments, I could forget the lie, forget that I was living a stolen life. And then, at night, alone in her room, surrounded by her belongings, I would look in the mirror and see her face reconstructed on mine. And I would remember, always remember. She stood slowly, the painful movement of someone carrying an invisible but crushing weight. Tell Camden I'll be gone until the end of the week. Richard has all the documents signed, all the testimonies recorded. There's no reason for me to prolong their agony with my presence. Vivienne climbed the stairs, and Penelope watched her disappear down the upper hallway, wondering if she felt compassion or contempt for a woman who had built an entire life on a foundation of tragedy and deceit. Perhaps both could coexist, an understanding of the human pain that drives people to destructive choices, coupled with the recognition that understanding does not equate to absolution. Richard Castellano emerged from the living room, his expression grave but controlled. He noticed Penelope in the hallway and approached, lowering his voice. "Camden asked me to speak with you as well. There are legal aspects of your own involvement that we need to address." Seeing panic cross Penelope's face, he raised a hand in a reassuring gesture. "You're not in trouble. Camden made it very clear that he doesn't wish to pursue any action against you. But your distribution of the photographs, while not technically illegal, since there was no commercial expectation of privacy, does raise questions of employee confidentiality." Penelope nodded slowly, her heart quickening. "I'll resign, of course. I can't expect to continue working here after what I've done." "Actually," Richard replied carefully, "Camden specifically asked that you remain. He feels your presence provides some stability during a chaotic period, and frankly, you're the only person besides him who knows the complete truth about the situation. But if you choose to leave, he will understand." Before Penelope could respond, Camden appeared in the living room doorway. He looked as though he'd aged 5 years in 3 days, dark circles beneath his eyes, and a new tension around his mouth. But there was something else, too. A sense of lightness that hadn't been there before, as if some suffocating weight had finally been removed. "My parents are staying tonight," he informed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "My mother isn't in a condition to go home yet. Penelope, could you prepare the main guest suite? And perhaps some light soup? I don't think any of us can stomach a full meal." "Of course," Penelope replied immediately, grateful for concrete directives amidst the emotional storm. She moved toward the kitchen, but Camden's hand on her arm gently stopped her. "And Penelope?" His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a complex gratitude mixed with forgiveness she didn't deserve. "Thank you for staying. I know it's a lot to ask after everything, but your presence, it helps." Tears pricked Penelope's eyes as she nodded, unable to trust her voice. She made her way to the kitchen, where she began the mechanical process of preparing food that might bring small comfort amidst the crumbling of a world built on lies. Through the window, she could see the Pacific Ocean continuing its eternal dance with the shore, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in the mansions along the cliffs. That night, as the hearts remained gathered in the living room, processing renewed grief, Penelope sat alone in her small room, holding the original photograph she had stolen from Camden's wallet weeks ago. She looked at the kiss between twin siblings captured in their last moment of shared joy, and finally understood the true magnitude of what she had unleashed. Sometimes the most destructive actions pave the way for truths that, however painful, are necessary for liberation. And sometimes the most unlikely people become agents of that liberation, not through virtue or wisdom, but through human flaws that accidentally align with a greater need for honesty. The news leaked to the press on a rainy Thursday, 3 weeks after the initial confrontation with Vivienne. Despite Richard Castellano's meticulous efforts to keep the situation under discreet legal control, someone, a hospital employee where the original medical records were subpoenaed, or perhaps an assistant at the forensic office, sold fragments of the story to tabloids that transformed a complex human tragedy into a sensational headline. "Imposter lived as Hart Iris for a decade after twin sister's death," screamed the front page of the Los Angeles Tribune. Smaller outlets followed with even more grotesque variations. "Sinister substitution. How best friend stole dead girl's identity." And "Billionaire CEO lived with ghost, while real sister lay in unmarked grave." Penelope discovered the leak when she came down to the kitchen at 5 in the morning and found Camden sitting in the dark, his laptop casting a ghostly bluish light on his tense face. He didn't turn when she flicked on the lights, his eyes fixed on a screen displaying dozens of open tabs, each showing some distorted version of his private life being dissected for public consumption. "It's begun," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "Richard called me at 4. There are news crews camped out at the property gates. My parents have already received 12 calls from journalists. The Heart Industries Board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Penelope approached hesitantly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The muscle beneath her palm was taut like a steel cable, trembling slightly with contained tension. "What do you need? How can I help?" Camden finally tore his eyes from the screen, turning to face her. Exhaustion was etched deeply into his features, but there was also something more, a quiet determination that had replaced the silent despair that had characterized him for years. "I need you to help me tell the true story," he replied. "Not the distorted version the tabloids are selling, but the complete reality. Margot deserves that. My parents deserve that. Even Vivienne, with all her devastating flaws, deserves to have her humanity recognized instead of being turned into a one-dimensional villain." He closed the laptop with decisive firmness. "Richard is organizing a press conference for tomorrow. I'm going to speak directly, without corporate filters or prepared PR statements. I'll tell them about Margot, about the accident, about how Vivienne assumed her identity, and why I allowed the charade to continue. And I will take responsibility for my own complicity in this decade-long lie." Penelope pulled up a chair, sitting across from him. "You don't have an obligation to expose everything publicly. Richard can manage this through legal channels, written statements." "No," Camden interrupted her gently but firmly. "Secrets brought us to this point. Secrets killed my sister a second time, imprisoned Vivienne in a stolen identity, froze my parents in suspended grief, and turned me into a ghost navigating my own existence. No more hiding." He stood, moving to the window where the first lights of dawn were beginning to tint the Pacific horizon with rosy and golden hues. "There's something else I need to tell you, Penelope. Something I've been putting off because I didn't know how to articulate it." The tone in his voice made Penelope's heart quicken. She remained silent, waiting. "When you spread those photographs, when your impulsive, misguided action exploded my carefully controlled life into millions of fragments, my first reaction was fury. But beneath the anger was something deeper. Relief so intense, it almost buckled me." Camden pressed his forehead against the cool windowpane. "For 10 years, I woke up every morning carrying the weight of a lie that was slowly crushing anything genuine inside me. And then, you, unknowingly, unintentionally, created the crisis that finally forced me to confront everything." He turned to face her, and Penelope saw in his eyes a vulnerability that made her want to simultaneously embrace him and retreat to the safety of the professional distance that had once defined their relationship. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand why you did it," Camden continued. "Richard discreetly investigated, found records from the copy shop, reconstructed your movements that night. And when I finally asked you directly about your motivations, you mentioned jealousy, but I didn't explore what that truly meant." Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. This was the conversation she had dreaded since the initial confrontation, the moment her pathetic, one-sided attraction to her employer would be exposed and dissected under the relentless light of reality. "Camden, please, we don't need to." "We do," he said gently, "because during these same weeks, while processing the revelation about Vivian and preparing to finally tell the truth about Margot, I realized something about you. I realized that for 2 entire years, you were the only person in this house who saw me as a human instead of a function or a symbol. You noticed when I was exhausted, adjusted small things to bring comfort, kept this mansion running not just as an efficient employee, but as someone who genuinely cared about my well-being." He took a step toward her, closing some of the distance between them. "And I realized that your actions, however destructive, came from a place of genuine emotion. You cared enough to feel pain when you thought I was hiding a relationship. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it provides context I can't ignore." Tears began to stream down Penelope's face, years of repressed emotions finally breaking through the barriers she had so carefully built. "I had no right to feel anything. You were my employer. I was just the housekeeper you barely noticed. But I created a pathetic fantasy where my small acts of care meant something more than just domestic service." "They weren't pathetic," Camden replied, his voice carrying an intensity that made her lift her tear-filled eyes. "For years, when I existed in emotional numbness, your gestures were unique points of genuine warmth. I noticed, Penelope. I noticed the white lilies, the coffee brewed exactly how I preferred it, the curtains open on Tuesday mornings. I noticed, and I was grateful. But I was so lost in my own psychological prison that I couldn't recognize what it meant." He moved closer, now just a step away from her. "I'm not saying this to create expectations or obligations. I know that the power dynamic between employer and employee makes anything beyond a professional relationship problematic. But in the spirit of honesty I'm trying to embrace, I need you to know that your actions, however imperfect, broke something in me that needed to be broken. And in the process, you showed me that I'm still capable of feeling something beyond numb pain and suffocating obligation." The silence that followed pulsed, with intertwined possibility and uncertainty. Penelope fought against the urge to close the remaining distance, knowing that to do so would be to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. Camden remained motionless, clearly fighting a similar internal battle. It was the sound of tires on gravel that broke the moment. Richard Castellano, arriving early for final preparations for the press conference. Camden took a step back, and something in the air between them dissipated, returning to the safer territory of professional formality. "I'm going to need you today," Camden said, his voice returning to a more neutral tone. "The conference will be broadcast from this house, and there will be dozens of people coming and going. Are you willing to manage the logistics?" "Of course," Penelope replied, grateful for concrete directives that kept her from processing the emotional implications of the conversation that had just occurred. "I'll prepare coffee and arrange the library to best accommodate the broadcasting equipment." The day that followed was a chaotic whirlwind of preparations. Richard arrived with a team of 3 assistants, followed by a media consultant specializing in crisis management, a professional videographer who transformed Camden's elegant library into an impromptu broadcasting studio, and 2 women from the Hart Industries public relations team who repeatedly tried to convince Camden to soften his planned testimony. "Mr. Hart, with all due respect, admitting complicity in identity fraud will open you up to devastating criticism," one of the PR women argued, her voice tight with frustration after the 3rd rejected revision of the prepared speech. "We can frame this as you being a victim of elaborate psychological manipulation." "I will not lie to protect my public image," Camden interrupted her firmly. "I was complicit. I chose to allow Vivian to continue the charade because it was easier than facing the truth. Those choices had devastating consequences, and I will take responsibility for them. Eleanor and Alexander Hart arrived at noon, both visibly weakened by weeks of traumatic revelations. Eleanor hugged Camden for a long moment, tears silently streaming down her cheeks, before whispering something Penelope couldn't hear. Whatever she said made Camden close his eyes in visible relief, his own shoulders shaking with contained emotion. By 3 in the afternoon, the library was transformed. Cameras mounted on tripods, professional lights positioned for optimal illumination, microphones tested and retested. Chairs were arranged for Camden's parents, who would sit beside him during the broadcast, a decision Richard had initially argued against, but which Camden insisted was essential. This was a family story, and it would be told as such. Penelope watched from the back of the room as Camden sat before the cameras, flanked by his parents. He wore a simple but impeccably tailored suit, chosen not to convey excessive opulence, but to maintain appropriate seriousness. His hands rested calmly in his lap, but Penelope noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, the only external sign of the emotional storm he must have been weathering. When the cameras began to broadcast live, Camden took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was firm, but laden with genuine emotion as he told the full story. Margot, his twin sister and best friend from the moment they shared the womb. The horrible accident that took her from him on the day that was supposed to have been the celebration of her wedding. Vivian Ashford, Margot's best friend, whose own miraculous survival came at the cost of devastating injuries that necessitated complete facial reconstruction. He spoke about how Vivian chose to transform herself into Margot during those surgeries, how she emerged from the hospital claiming her dead friend's identity, and how he, in his grief and cowardice, allowed the charade to continue because his parents desperately needed to believe their daughter had survived. "I was wrong," Camden said directly to the camera, his voice breaking slightly. "I was wrong to allow this to continue. I was wrong to prioritize my parents' temporary comfort over the truth we all deserved. Margot deserved to be properly mourned, not forgotten behind someone else's mask. Vivian deserved the chance to process her own trauma instead of being encouraged to live in permanent denial. And my parents deserved the opportunity to face real loss instead of existing in a comforting illusion." Eleanor, seated to his right, took his hand. When the camera turned to her, tears were streaming down her face, but she spoke with surprising clarity. "As a mother, I want everyone to understand something. Vivian Ashford is not a monster. She is a deeply traumatized young woman who made terrible choices born of pain none of us can truly comprehend. I am furious with her, yes. I feel betrayed beyond the ability to adequately express it. But I also recognize that for 10 years, she brought moments of joy to our family that desperately needed light during a very dark period." Alexander added his own perspective, his voice hoarse but firm. "We want people to know about the real Margot. Margot Eleanor Hart, born on March 17, 1991, 3 minutes before her twin brother Camden. She loved jazz music, worked as an art consultant, and had a laugh that lit up entire rooms. She is the one who should be remembered, not the charade that replaced her." The broadcast lasted 47 minutes. When it finally ended, cameras off and professional lights extinguished, Camden slumped in his chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Eleanor and Alexander remained by his side, the three united in shared exhaustion and the relief of finally having told the truth. Penelope watched from the doorway, tears streaming freely down her face, a witness to a family finally breaking free from a prison built on lies and unprocessed grief. And amidst the collective catharsis, she understood something fundamental. Her own actions, born from selfish and destructive motivations, had accidentally served a greater purpose. Sometimes it takes imperfect acts from imperfect people to break cycles of deception that would otherwise continue indefinitely. The public response to Camden's live broadcast was a tsunami of conflicting reactions that inundated all social media platforms, news outlets, and everyday conversations across the entire country. In the first 12 hours after the press conference, the video garnered 23 million views, sparking passionate discussions about ethics, trauma, forgiveness, and the moral complexities of choices made under extraordinary circumstances. Penelope watched the media phenomenon unfold from her small room, scrolling endlessly through comments that ranged from heartwarming support to relentless judgment. Some praised Camden's courage in taking public responsibility for his complicity. Others condemned him for allowing the charade to continue, arguing that 10 years of deception could not be absolved by a single public confession, no matter how sincere. Vivienne instantly became a polarizing figure. Therapists and trauma specialists appeared on morning shows to debate whether her actions constituted calculated fraud or an understandable dissociative response to psychological catastrophe. Tabloids alternated between portraying her as a manipulative villain and a tragic victim, often within the same article, reflecting the broader cultural inability to categorize human behavior into comfortable binaries of good and bad. But amidst the media chaos, something unexpected began to emerge. People began sharing their own stories of loss, deception, and impossible choices made during moments of desperation. A woman in Detroit posted about how she had assumed the identity of her deceased sister to escape an abusive relationship. A man in Seattle described allowing his parents to believe his twin brother, killed in combat, was merely missing, prolonging their hope for years to spare them the final pain of confirmation. The confessions multiplied, creating a national conversation about the complicated ways humans navigate trauma and the lies they tell to survive intolerable circumstances. Camden found himself inadvertently at the center of a cultural movement, examining the nature of truth, identity, and redemption. Invitations for interviews arrived daily, all of which Richard advised against until the legal ramifications were fully resolved. But the opportunities Camden chose to accept revealed something about his personal evolution. 3 weeks after the initial broadcast, he appeared on a popular podcast focused on mental health and trauma, where he spent 2 hours conversing with a psychologist specializing in complicated grief. The conversation was profound and devoid of sensationalism, exploring how the loss of a twin creates a unique void that defies conventional patterns of mourning, and how family systems sometimes construct shared mythologies to collectively survive the unbearable. Penelope listened to the entire interview while preparing dinner in the mansion's kitchen, tears silently streaming down her cheeks as Camden described feeling Margot's absence as a constant phantom presence. He spoke about how twins develop a shared language that exists beyond words, how they could communicate entire volumes with a single look, and how, when she died, he lost not only a sister, but a translator of his own internal experience. The interview touched millions, including other surviving twins who had lost their other halves and found comfort in hearing their specific suffering articulated with such eloquence. Online support groups dedicated to surviving twins experienced an increase in membership, and several organizations focused on complex grief contacted Camden to contribute educational resources. But amidst the growing public impact, Camden's personal situation remained delicately complex. Vivienne had left Newport Beach 2 days after the broadcast, moving to a small apartment in Portland under an agreement negotiated by Richard. She had signed a comprehensive document agreeing never to publicly use the Hart name again, never to give interviews about the situation, and to undergo intensive therapy as a condition of avoiding criminal charges. Eleanor and Alexander Hart were slowly rebuilding their lives around the truth they could finally acknowledge. They had organized a small, private memorial for Margot in the mansion garden, planting a white magnolia she adored, and placing a simple plaque with her real name and dates that finally honored her true existence. The proper mourning ritual brought some measure of closure that had been absent for an entire decade. Penelope found herself in an increasingly ambiguous position within the Hart household. Technically still a housekeeper, but increasingly treated as something closer to a family confidant. Eleanor had begun inviting her to dinner instead of asking her to serve, and Alexander often sought her perspective during family conversations, valuing her position as an outside observer who knew intimate details of their situation. And then there was Camden, whose relationship with Penelope had evolved into territory neither of them knew how to navigate. They shared coffee in the mornings as he prepared for the day, talked late into the night when insomnia kept both of them awake, and developed an intimacy built on shared vulnerability and mutual understanding of how imperfect actions can yield redemptive consequences. But the inherent power dynamic in their employer-employee relationship created constant tension, an invisible line neither dared to cross, despite the growing attraction that pulsed between them like an electrical current. It was Richard Castellano who finally forced the conversation they had both been avoiding. He arrived at the mansion on a Friday afternoon, requesting a meeting with Camden and Penelope together. They sat in the library, now stripped of all broadcasting equipment, and returned to its original function as a silent, book-lined sanctuary. Richard removed his reading glasses, meticulously cleaning them before speaking, his usual process when preparing to address a delicate matter. "We need to discuss something you've both been avoiding, but which cannot continue indefinitely without formal resolution." Camden and Penelope exchanged a look, both instantly understanding what was coming. "Penelope, you have remained in this house through extraordinary circumstances," Richard began, addressing her directly. "Your position has evolved significantly beyond a housekeeper to something that defies simple categorization. And, Camden, your reliance on Penelope for emotional support during this traumatic period is understandable, but creates legal and ethical complications that we cannot ignore." He placed a leather folder on the table between them. "I've prepared two possible paths forward. First, we can formalize a new position for Penelope within the Hart organization, something like a personal assistant or property manager with appropriate compensation and benefits that reflect her expanded responsibilities. This would maintain a clear professional relationship while acknowledging changed realities." Richard paused, his gaze moving between them. "Or second, Penelope can leave employment entirely, allowing any personal relationship that might develop between you to do so without complications from an employer-employee dynamic. Camden could provide a generous compensation package reflecting her extraordinary contributions during a period of crisis, creating a clean separation that protects both of you legally and ethically." The silence that followed pulsed, with the weight of choices that would irreversibly alter the course of both their lives. Penelope felt her heart quicken, her mind racing through the implications of each option. Staying meant financial security, but a relationship perpetually limited by professional boundaries. Leaving meant uncertainty, but the possibility of something genuine and uncomplicated by power imbalance. Camden stood up, moving to the window where afternoon light filtered through linen curtains. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that Penelope had learned to recognize as his most authentic state. "For 10 years, I lived in a prison built of obligations and appearances. I made choices based on protecting others from the discomfort of a difficult truth, and those choices consumed me from the inside out. He turned to face Penelope directly. I don't want to make a similar mistake now, by keeping you in an ambiguous position because it's convenient or comfortable for me. He returned to the table, sitting so he was directly facing her. Penelope, you deserve clarity about what I feel. For months, perhaps even years, you were the only person in my life who saw me as a complete human instead of a function or a symbol. Your acts of care, even the small ones you thought I didn't notice, were anchors that kept me connected to the possibility that genuine connection could still exist. Tears began to form in Penelope's eyes as she absorbed his words, years of repressed emotion finally finding validation. When you spread those photographs, when your jealousy and pain led you to a destructive action, part of me recognized in it a reflection of my own darker impulses. Camden continued, You acted imperfectly, driven by messy human emotion, and accidentally created an opportunity for liberation that I never would have found on my own. How can I condemn that? How can I not feel something profound for a person whose flaws somehow aligned perfectly with my unrecognized needs? He reached his hand across the table, stopping before touching hers, leaving the choice to her. But I also recognize that everything I feel is complicated by the extraordinary circumstances we've experienced. Perhaps it's gratitude that I'm confusing with something more. Perhaps it's shared vulnerability that creates the illusion of deeper intimacy. I don't know for absolute certain, and it would be unfair to both of us to act based on uncertainty. Penelope looked at his hand suspended in the space between them, a perfect symbol of everything that remained unresolved between them. Then she placed her own hand in his, feeling the familiar electricity of his touch that sent shivers down her arm. I should leave, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Not because I don't feel something real for you, but because I need to discover who I am outside of this house, outside of the caretaker role I used as a mask for deeper emotions I was afraid to acknowledge. Camden gently closed his fingers around hers, holding her hand as someone would hold a wounded bird, with a care that recognized fragility. How much time do you need? I don't know, Penelope admitted. Months, maybe. Enough time to build an identity not defined by being someone's employee or the object of someone's affections. Time to process my own guilt about what I did and find a form of redemption that doesn't depend on your forgiveness. Richard watched the exchange with an expression of discreet approval. I find this decision remarkably mature from both of you. Penelope, I will prepare a compensation package that will give you financial stability during this transitional period. Camden, I suggest you continue the therapy you've started and perhaps explore relationships that don't carry the weight of everything you've shared. They remained like that for another moment, hands intertwined across the table, both understanding they were choosing something more difficult but more honest than simply allowing circumstances to drag them into a relationship built on a foundation of trauma and mutual dependence. When Penelope finally released his hand, she felt simultaneously loss and liberation, like cutting a rope that had both bound her and sustained her through a storm. 6 months had passed since Penelope Drake left the Hart Mansion in Newport Beach, carrying 2 suitcases of clothes and a check that represented not just financial compensation, but an acknowledgement that her presence had meant something beyond domestic service. She had found a small apartment in Santa Monica, a few blocks from the beach, where the constant sound of the waves simultaneously reminded her of everything she had left behind and everything she was building for herself. The first few months were an exercise in deliberate solitude. Penelope refused to allow her identity to continue to be defined by her relationship with Camden Hart or anyone else. She enrolled in a small business administration course at the local community college, something she had put off for years while working jobs that paid the bills but didn't nurture deeper ambitions. She began weekly therapy with a psychologist specializing in self-esteem and relationship patterns, exploring the roots of why she had allowed herself to exist in the shadows of someone else's life for so long. Camden had maintained a respectful distance, as they had agreed. But once a month, without fail, he would send a simple text message through Richard Castellano, asking how she was and sharing brief updates about his own journey. Penelope learned that he was also in intensive therapy, processing not just the trauma of losing Margot, but lifelong patterns of prioritizing others' comfort over his own truth. Eleanor and Alexander were gradually recovering, finding peace in finally being able to honor their daughter's real memory. And Vivian, according to reports, was in Portland working in a small restaurant and attending regular support group meetings for complex trauma. Their story had gradually faded from the news cycle, replaced by more recent scandals and more immediate tragedies. But it had left a lasting mark on cultural conversations about identity, truth, and the complicated ways humans navigate unbearable loss. Camden was occasionally invited to speak at conferences on business ethics or mental health, always declining compensation and redirecting any attention to organizations dedicated to supporting trauma survivors and bereaved individuals navigating complicated loss. On a Thursday afternoon in early November, when Santa Monica was shrouded in a marine layer that softened the contours of everything, Penelope received a call from Richard Castellano. His voice carried an unusual urgency when he asked if she could meet him at a coffee shop near her community college. She found him sitting in a quiet corner, 2 cups of coffee already waiting on the table. Richard stood when she approached, gesturing for her to sit before pushing a manila envelope across the worn surface of the table. "Camden asked me to deliver this personally," he explained. "He wanted to ensure you had a choice about how to proceed, without pressure or expectations." Penelope opened the envelope with trembling hands, discovering a handwritten letter and a second, smaller envelope. She immediately recognized Camden's elegant handwriting, each letter formed with deliberate care that reflected his meticulous nature. The letter began simply, "Dear Penelope." Oh, he wrote about the months since she had left, about how therapy had helped him recognize patterns of emotional avoidance that governed his life long before Margot's death. He described a painful but necessary process of distinguishing gratitude from genuine affection, dependence from real love. He admitted that in the first few months after her departure, he wasn't sure if what he felt for her was truly a deep connection or simply a psychological association between her and his liberation from the deception that had imprisoned him. But now, after half a year of distance and deliberate introspection, he wrote, "I can say with certainty that what I feel for you transcends the circumstances of how we met. I think of you not as the person who accidentally freed me, but as the woman whose laugh I would like to hear every morning, whose thoughts I would like to know in their complexities, whose presence brings a sense of belonging I've never experienced with anyone else." Penelope felt tears welling in her eyes as she continued to read. Camden described hesitating to contact her, fearing it was too soon, that she needed more time to build an independent identity. But his parents encouraged him, Eleanor specifically arguing that sometimes perfect timing was a myth, and that genuine connection deserved to be explored even when circumstances were less than ideal. In the smaller envelope, the letter continued, "You'll find 2 tickets to an art exhibition at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art this Saturday. It's a retrospective of an artist Margot adored, someone whose work she frequently discussed with a passion that completely lit up her face. "I'm organizing a small memorial event there, just close family, and a few intimate friends of Margot's, finally celebrating who she really was instead of who we pretended she was." He explained that he didn't expect her to come, that he would completely understand if she preferred to keep her distance. But if she chose to attend, he would be grateful for the opportunity to see her again, to talk without the weight of immediate crisis or an employer-employee dynamic coloring every interaction. The letter ended simply. "You taught me that sometimes the most imperfect actions lead to the most necessary consequences. Perhaps it's time we discover if our imperfections can create something beautiful together. With an affection I don't dare call love yet, but which feels extraordinarily close, Camden." Penelope placed the letter carefully on the table, her hands trembling as she processed his words. Richard watched her with a paternal expression she had learned to recognize as genuine concern. "He's being sincere," Richard said softly. "I've spent considerable time with Camden over the last few months, and the transformation in him is remarkable. He's done the work, Penelope, not just superficially, but deeply, confronting truths about himself that most people spend entire lifetimes avoiding." Penelope nodded slowly, absorbing it all. She, too, had done the work, explored in therapy why she had allowed herself to exist in an invisible caregiver role, why she had sought validation through serving others instead of cultivating her own ambitions. And through that process, she had discovered she could stand on her own, that she had worth independent of her usefulness to someone else. "Do you think I'm ready?" she heard herself ask, the vulnerability in her voice surprising both of them. Richard smiled gently. "I think the only person who can answer that is you. But I can tell you that you now have something you didn't have 6 months ago. Clarity about who you are outside the context of being Camden's employee or the object of his affection. And that clarity will make all the difference in any relationship you choose to build." The following Saturday, Penelope found herself standing before the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, holding the 2 tickets Camden had sent. She had spent an entire hour getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a simple navy blue dress that Eleanor had once commented brought out her eyes. It was no longer a maid's uniform or carefully neutral attire designed to fade into the background. It was a choice that reflected who she was becoming, someone who deserved to be seen. The museum interior was quiet in the early afternoon, light filtering through skylights, creating soft patterns on polished marble floors. Penelope followed signs to the special gallery, where a retrospective was being held, her footsteps echoing softly as she approached. Camden was standing before a large painting when she entered, flanked by his parents and a small group of people she didn't recognize. He wore a gray cashmere sweater and elegant trousers, more casual than his usual business attire, and something in his posture suggested a lightness she had never witnessed before. When he turned and saw her, his entire face lit with a smile so genuine it temporarily stole her breath. He excused himself from the others and crossed the gallery toward her, each step measured, yet determined. When he finally stood before her, he maintained a respectful distance, allowing her to dictate the terms of their encounter. "Penelope," he said simply, and there were entire oceans of meaning in the way he pronounced her name. "I'm so grateful you came." "I almost didn't," she admitted honestly. "I stayed awake half the night debating with myself, making pros and cons lists, like a teenager grappling with a first date." Camden laughed, and the sound was rich and unforced, so different from the controlled chuckles she remembered from the mansion. I made a list, too. In fact, I made 3 different versions before finally admitting that no amount of rational analysis could tell me what my heart already knew. Eleanor approached before Penelope could respond, enveloping her in a warm embrace that communicated forgiveness and acceptance Penelope wasn't sure she deserved. "My dear girl," Eleanor whispered, "you were an essential part of our liberation, and that makes you family in every sense that matters." The next 2 hours unfolded in a series of deep conversations as the small group toured the exhibition. Camden shared memories of Margot related to specific pieces, finally able to speak about his sister with joy, untainted by deceit. Alexander contributed his own stories, and the friends present added perspectives that painted a complete picture of a young woman who had lived vibrantly and completely before being tragically taken too soon. Penelope found herself contributing observations about the artworks, her business administration course having awakened a dormant interest in art history that she had begun to explore as a hobby. Camden watched her with something akin to reverence as she discussed the composition and emotional significance of a specific piece, and she realized he was seeing her as she had always wished to be seen, as a complete person with her own thoughts and passions that extended beyond serving someone else's needs. When the memorial gathering concluded and others began to bid farewell, Camden gently took Penelope's elbow. "Do you have time to walk with me? There's a terrace upstairs with a view of the city that I've always found particularly peaceful." She nodded, allowing him to guide her through quiet corridors to an open space where Los Angeles stretched out before them in a vast expanse of possibilities. They stood side by side at the railing, shoulders almost touching but still maintaining that last fraction of distance that acknowledged what came next would require conscious choice from both of them. "I've done a lot of thinking these past few months," Camden began, his eyes fixed on the horizon, "about who I was before Margot died, who I became during years of deceit, and who I want to be now that I can finally live in truth." He turned to face her directly, and Penelope saw in his eyes a clarity that came from genuine self-discovery. "I've learned that I can exist on my own, that I don't need someone else to complete me or define my worth. But I've also learned that choosing to be with someone when you could easily exist alone makes that choice infinitely more meaningful." Penelope felt her heart quicken, years of suppressed emotion finally finding validation in his words. "I've learned something similar," she replied softly. "I've learned that I can stand on my own, that I have ambitions and dreams that are mine, and not reflections of someone else's desires. And I've learned that true connection doesn't diminish that independence, but enhances it." Camden extended his hand, this time not stopping before touching, but allowing his fingers to find hers in a gesture that was at once a question and a promise. "So perhaps we can explore what it means to build something together. Two complete individuals choosing to share their lives not out of need or circumstance, but out of genuine affection and mutual respect." Penelope intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the electric familiarity of his touch that now carried new meaning. It was no longer a touch between employer and employee, or savior and saved, but something fundamentally more honest and balanced. "Yes," she said simply, and in that single word was contained the full weight of a conscious choice to embrace the possibility of love built on a foundation of truth, shared imperfection, and mutual growth. As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific Ocean, painting the Los Angeles sky in hues of amber and rose, Camden and Penelope remained on the terrace, hands intertwined, talking about futures they could finally imagine without shadows of deceit or unbalanced power dynamics coloring every possibility. They spoke of Penelope's dreams of eventually opening a small event planning business, Camden's plans to transform Hart Industries into a company more focused on social responsibility, and how they could support each other's ambitions while building a shared life on their own terms. It wouldn't be easy, they both recognized. They would carry with them the scars of everything they had experienced, moments of doubt about whether they were building something real or simply reacting to shared trauma. But for the first time in their lives, both were choosing conscious vulnerability over safe protection, authentic connection over comfortable convenience. And in that choice, freely made by two individuals who finally knew each other completely outside the roles that once defined their existences, there was the possibility of something extraordinary. Love built not on need or circumstance, but on the mutual recognition that the most imperfect people often offer the most profound gifts, if we are willing to embrace both their flaws and their virtues.